Woo. I'm going to tell you something that you may or may not know. This is the hardest part about being a pastor. And I know what you're thinking, like, what, the one day a week? Like, that's the one day of work a week, that's the hardest part? No, actually, the hardest part about being a pastor is when we're put on a pedestal in front of the rest of the world. That people elevate your understanding and perspective of who a pastor is and what a pastor looks like and what a pastor does. And to be honest with you, we're no different. Like, we're just sinners like everybody else. We're just broken like everybody else. We make mistakes all the time like everybody else. And when that happens in a public place, it's horrifying. It's horrible. I've got to work through my stuff too. And yet, when it comes out in a public place, and you've seen this, you've seen the headlines, it can actually disrupt and destroy what the church is doing. It can destroy ministries. And the worst part about all this is that it actually puts a barrier in front of people stepping into church, maybe for the first time ever. They make this excuse. It's not even an excuse. It's just a reason. It's like, one more reason of why I don't show up to church is because, did you see that headline? Did you see what that pastor did? Did you hear about that? And it ruins everything. Like, it destroys everything. It allows somebody to step away from God rather than to God. And I'm going to need someone. This is not working right now. So, Rayla! There we go. We recently, in our staff meetings, we've been, she showed up. She helps everything. But we actually have been reading this book, and it's in our staff meetings. And it's like 15 years old or so, written by Craig Rochelle. And in one of the chapters, it actually shows like a list of pastors that are like innovative leaders. And he's going on and on about these pastors. And when I read it, my heart kind of sank, because almost half of the list is like, oh, like there's some scandals that have been going. Some of them aren't even pastors anymore. Like, it's rough. I'm like, that's awful. It's awful. Now, the reality is this is not limited to pastors, right? We think, that's pretty bad. But we know this too. We read the headlines too. It's not just pastors. It's everybody, because this is a people issue. This is a humanity issue. And when we look at these life stories and these moments where like everything bubbles out and everything comes out, we think, how did they do that? How did they allow that to happen? How did they keep on for so long? And they kept on showing up to dinner at night? Like, what? And they kept on like hiding it for that long? And they kept on showing up to church, or in a pastor's case, preaching at church? Like, how did they do that for so long? When the truth spills out, families are devastated. Careers are destroyed. Like, future hopes and dreams are minimized, completely altered. Reputations are forever changed. And we think to ourselves, I couldn't live with myself. I couldn't live with myself. You think that your conscience, your integrity is so strong that it wouldn't allow you to go down that route. But here's the reality, and I need everyone to hear this. You'd be wrong. You'd absolutely be wrong. You couldn't live with your current self. But if left unattended, your current self may not be your future self. Like, the way that you see yourself right now, you're like, no, that could never happen. But if you let some things get out of place, if you don't attend to them, eventually they could place you in a situation where you're not even your current self may not even be your future self. It doesn't look the same. You're not the same person. The reason this could absolutely happen, regardless of how moral, how ethical, how good of a person you are currently, you don't think that it could happen to you. You don't think it could happen to you. You're like, no, I'm good. I've got this under wraps. I got this under control. It's not going to happen to me. And that's exactly why you're vulnerable to it happening to you. Because if you think that something is impossible, you don't prepare for it. Like, oh, that's never going to happen, so I don't need to worry about that happening. I mean, this in essence, this is like going camping and just not worrying about bears. You're like, you know what? That's impossible that a bear would show up. Yeah, just leave all the trash right in the middle of the campsite. Bears aren't coming here. It's impossible for bears to show up. And then what happens? Bears show up. You're like, oh my goodness, I didn't think this was possible. And instead, the exact thing that I didn't think was possible happened. So we're not talking about camping during the series, but we're talking about those elements of our life that we don't want to walk into, we don't want to step into, we don't want to become that person. And this is what we're talking about in this series, living with yourself. 3 habits to safeguard your soul. These are 3 different ideas, 3 different habits that if you put this in place, it will absolutely ensure that you don't go down a road that you don't want to go down. That other people will experience the real, authentic you. That you don't have to project, you don't have to pretend to be somebody else in all of the different environments and places that you go. You're just you everywhere. You're consistently, authentically you. Life is incredibly hard, especially on our souls. I mean, the longer I get into life, it's like, man, this is getting harder. It's just, you get tired, you get exhausted. Your soul gets tired and exhausted. You're like, man, this is just, it's hard. Life is hard on us. And what I've seen and what I've noticed is that nothing gets better when it's left unattended, when it's left all by itself. I mean, think about right now, beautiful, right? Everybody's getting their garden going, their flower beds, it's wonderful. If you leave your beautiful, wonderful flower beds and gardens unattended, you're like, man, I got a good start, just let them go. What's going to happen? In like a week, it looks like a jungle. Like the weeds are going to grow up. The flowers, everything else that you've planted, that you've taken good care of, all of a sudden they're going to dry out, they're going to die. If you planted some like vegetables, they're going to grow, the fruits are going to die on the vine because you're not tending to them, you're not picking them, you're not taking care of them. If left unattended, everything gets ruined. Nothing gets better, it gets worse. And here's the thing. There's only one person that has anything to say about that. One person that has the authority and the responsibility that can do anything about this tension. And just a hint, it's not your mama. However much she wants it to be her, it's still not her. It's you. And it's only you. Now, the great part about these conversations is this isn't just a conversation for only church people, only Christian people. Like, this is a conversation we can have with everybody and anybody. Because we all have a soul. And we all have a direction in life that we want to move in and a direction in life we don't want to move in. Every single one of us. And here's what we know. The health of your soul determines your capacity for duplicity. Duplicity is how many yous there are. Like, is there a you for your work, and a you for your church, and a you for home and family time, and a you for, when you're playing golf, and a you for all those different areas and environments. Every single place that you have like a spot, is there a different you in each one of those spots? Is there a different one? This is exactly, duplicity is how you can live with yourself when you're different. It's because you decide that you can compartmentalize it away. It turns into hypocrisy. It turns into all kinds of things. Lying, pretending, and ultimately undermining the legitimacy of anything you say or do in every single one of your relationships. Duplicity determines whether you close the gap or whether you broaden it. Your ability, the health of your soul determines whether you're going to close that gap or broaden it. Whether you're going to stitch up the wound and there's going to be scars, or are you just going to merely manage the tension, try and justify it, try and normalize it. Yeah, this is what everybody does. This is normal. This is how this works. You might even be in like multiple of those arenas with different people that you know. It's like the same person, like 2 or 3 of them. And you're both like a different person in each one. You're like, well, these words are okay to say here. These words not okay to say there. Like it changes. And you're both like, there's this unspoken, like, yeah, we're good. We got it. We got it on lockdown. Here's the thing. You have the potential to become someone that you would despise if you met them. You have that potential. Every single one of us has that potential to despise yourself. And let me just say, if you're walking with that tension today, I get it. That is wearisome. That is painful. That ruins everything. I mean, that so clouds our vision for what's next. And you never thought it could happen. But the truth is, you can, and we all can become the unimaginable. You can do the unthinkable. And you can still live with yourself because of your duplicity. You can still do that. This happens solely because you don't think it can happen. So, in order to set up for this first habit that we're looking at today, we're going to first look at something that Paul wrote. Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote about half of the New Testament. Pretty big deal in Christianity. So Paul, he's going to say something, and on the surface, it just sounds ridiculous, honestly. When you read it for the first time, you're like, what are you talking about? That sounds crazy town. It sounds unreasonable. But as we get into it, and you might have read this before, you might have looked at this 100 times, but as we look into it, we're going to see that there's a twist in here, and it becomes the most reasonable, the most logical. So we're going to start in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy. This isn't in view of God's authority, in view of God's power, in view of God's mercy. Now, Paul, if you haven't read Romans before, he just spent the previous 11 chapters describing God's incredible, great mercy that he's extended to us through Jesus Christ. And in light of everything that he did, this is where it turns. This is where it gets to. In light of all of that, and in light of all of that mercy, 12:1, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. So there it is. That's like what are you talking about? I mean, we don't make sacrifices today like they did back then. Like we can hardly make sense of what that looks like. For them, it made sense and it was nuts. You're like, wait, hold on a sec. I killed a lamb the other day, like I killed a sheep. That's what we're supposed to do, except we're supposed to be living. How does that work? What does that even look like? I mean, it's confusing language. Choose to present yourself. Choose to yield. When we talk about offer, choose to submit, to trust yourself in God's hands. To trust wholly, altogether, all of you. To write a blank check with your life. Which, that sounds terrifying. You're like, no. I like it way better my way. My way is that when life gets hard, when I get into trouble, when I do the thing I shouldn't have done, then I call up God and I ask him to bail me out. Like that's normal. That's what we all do. It's like, yeah, no, but I'm just going to call God when I need help. When I need a little extra help, that's when I call him. But here's the problem. A non-surrendered Christian life doesn't work because surrender is how we follow Jesus. That's the way forward. That's how we do this. And if you're not surrendering, then you're just agreeing with some ideas. You haven't actually decided to follow step by step after Jesus. And I can prove this. Think about your greatest regret in life. Your greatest regret in life. And then think of it in terms of the season of life that you had when it came to your faith in that same season. Was that a similar season of you like, I'm giving God everything. I'm trusting him with all of this. Every single day I'm submitting to him. Or was this you like, yeah, I just think it's okay. Like just justify some things. Just like, I'm just going to call it. Like I'm going to pray if this turns out real bad. Like I'll ask for forgiveness rather than permission. Like that whole thing, which drives me nuts, to be honest with you. But was the worst regret in your life, and I'll call on God when I need him season? Was that when it happened? Because you thought you could pray your way out of what you behaved your way into, to be honest. You might have actually not thought it all the way through, but that's kind of your natural inclination. You're like, well, yeah, I mean, God forgives us of our sins, so he'll probably forgive this one too. We'll see how far it goes. The reality is this is a pattern. And to be honest, it is a pattern that every human naturally goes into, especially if we decide that we're going to cross the line of faith. We get into this pattern of, I'm going to see how close to the line I can get. And then if I cross the line, I'm going to pray and I'm asking that God forgive me. And then we're going to do the whole thing over again. I'm going to be good for a little while longer. And then eventually I'm just going to inch my way forward back towards the line again. And I'm going to send God one of those SOS prayers. Oh no, God, I've done it again. I've ruined it again. Life is falling apart. You call all your friends, come help me now. Let me ask you a question. Did God answer those SOS prayers? I mean, especially the way that you prayed. Did he answer them that way? I'm going to guess probably not. And it turns into a pattern. This is why sorry if I'm going to step on toes, but here we go. This is why some of you are thinking like, man, this marriage is starting to feel like the last marriage. God help me. Please forgive me. I made a mistake, blah, blah. And then you're like, yeah, but this one's starting to feel like the last one. Why? Because there's a cycle here. There's a thing that you're doing behaviorally that is repeated over and over again. What about that job? You're like, man, this job, I was all excited about it. I stepped into it, and almost it just feels like the last job I had, where everyone was just kind of frustrated with me all the time, and I was annoyed with my boss all the time, and he just doesn't understand me, or she just doesn't understand me. We get into the cycle, and then we get upset, and then all of a sudden someone gives us some insight, and we're like, oh, right. God, forgive me. Help me, do better next time. And we do what? We jump into the same cycle, around and around we go. This confessing, apologizing isn't changing the direction that you're moving. What changes that is when you decide to finally fully surrender, that you lay everything down, that you're going to trust God with it all, however painful it might be, however embarrassing it might be. This is true repentance, a life-changing directional shift. I am no longer going to trust myself. I'm going to place everything that I am in God's hands, and I'm just going to trust Him with it. Paul assures us that this offer, that, like I said, sounds kind of crazy. This offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, as much as it sounds crazy, is actually the most reasonable thing that we can possibly do. It says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. True and proper worship. Now, kind of the term here, the Greek term for this type of worship is logikos, which is where we get the word logical. It makes sense. It is the most reasonable thing to do. What Paul is saying is, in light of everything that Jesus did for you, in light of the great mercy that God extended for you, the forgiveness, the love, in spite of all of that, the most logical thing for you to do is respond by saying, God, I see what you've done, and I'm just going to give you me. I'm going to give you me. This is the most logical thing. The incredible part, God gave us free will. He doesn't demand that we offer ourselves as a living sacrifice. He doesn't demand that we step into a relationship with Him. He doesn't demand that we love Him. He gave us free will. Why? Because He wants real, authentic relationship with you. More than anything, He wants to be in a relationship with you. And in order to be in a relationship with you, you have to be able to choose no. You have to be able to choose, no, not this time. You've got to be able to have that choice. You've got to be able to have the choice to say, you know what, I'm just going to ask forgiveness and we'll do this dance one more time around. But that vulnerability is a choice. That the authentic decision to follow Jesus is absolutely a choice. And the great news is, He is incredibly trustworthy. When you decide to trust Him, when you decide to move in His direction, when you decide to open your hands and everything that He's given you, Say, okay, God, you got it. You've got it. He knows what's best for you. He knows what's best for you better than you do. This is incredible. Letting him guide us is wiser than us deciding we're going to guide us. Like we guide ourselves into mistakes all the time. We guide ourselves into sin better than anybody else. Like we do a real good job of getting off track. Trusting him, letting him guide, letting him lead actually makes us better at life. Jesus, his one another ethic, right? We talk about this all the time. That Jesus left us with this like, hey, here's the final, this is like the command. If you would just love other people the way that I've loved you, if you just do that, people will know that you follow me. People will know. That will change everything. Like, what about all the other, like, hundreds of laws? Yeah, I mean, they're important. But if you do this one thing, you will do those other laws. Like, really? I mean, think about trying to do the 10 Commandments without loving one another the way Jesus loved us. Can't do it. That's where it starts. That's where it starts. His love one another ethic is the best way to live. And we know this. I mean, we've seen this. When you prioritize relationship, when you decide to love somebody over something, decide that you don't have to be right in the relationship as much as you value the relationship itself. You're like, we're just arguing about this one thing. I can choose to back off of that one thing and value the relationship more. And you know what happens? Life gets better. It's amazing. When we respond to God, not to gain something, but because of what he's already done, life improves. Like you start to have peace that you never had before. What makes sense other than a daily submission? I mean, this is, like I said, this is the most logical, this is the most reasonable thing that you can do. Is not to skate by, but every single day start it with submission. Start it deciding, today, God, every aspect of me is yours. Paul actually teases this idea out a little bit earlier in Romans chapter 6, but he kind of uses the inverse kind of negative. So in chapter 6, verse 13, do not offer any part of yourself to sin as an instrument of wickedness. So what's interesting here, Paul personifies sin. He actually starts to describe sin as if it has human qualities and characteristics. And when we wrestle with sin, even that language, wrestling with sin, we understand this. It's almost like there's something that is in us. There's something that we're wrestling with. There's something that we're just like struggling with. Because I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. And then I do it again, even though I didn't want to do it again. Right? This is the wrestling match that we all go through. There's something. This is why he personifies sin. It's like we wrestle with this thing. And according to Paul, us offering ourselves is an either or. We are going to offer ourselves. It's just a matter of to whom are we going to offer ourselves? Are we going to offer ourselves to sin? Or are we going to offer ourselves to God? Sin is all about your appetites. It is my way. It's my stuff. It's my desires. It's what I want. I'm going to prioritize over you or your desires and what you want every single time. That leads to sin. This is what I see in my life. Even at the expense of my wife or my son or people that I love and care about, my sinful nature leads me to prioritize myself over them. And it's horrible. You feel awful. And you argue your way the whole time. So back to Romans 6:13. He says, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and offer every part of yourselves to him as an instrument of righteousness. And if I was going to start a rock band, it might be called Instrument of Righteousness. But offer every part of yourself, all of it. Surrender your hopes and your dreams. Surrender what's in your hands, what God has brought into your life. You have a job, you have You have a bank account, you have relationships, you have opportunities, you have things that you've gained and gathered in life that God has actually given you, that God has entrusted to you. And when I say I trust God, when I'm going to offer myself as a living sacrifice, it's not I trust Him with everything except for what's in my hands. I've got to offer that as well, because otherwise it's not all of me. Otherwise it's just a partial sacrifice. It's just a part of me. But what Paul is saying is we offer all of us, every aspect of my being, all of it. And here's the great news. This is the great news. Here's the good. For sin, like once you offer yourselves, once you decide this, for then sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. What you say yes to starts to take the lead. What you say yes to starts to tell you what you can and cannot do. What you say yes to turns into your master. And practically speaking, when you say yes to sin, ultimately, you're saying yes to selfishness. That's where you're saying yes to. This is the rub, because we are so selfish. I often tell people, the first moment that you realize how selfish you are is the moment that you get married. You're like, oh my goodness, I just want to do things my way all the time. And I've been able to do that because I'm the only one that's in charge of me. And then all of a sudden, there's another person in your life. You're like, what? I have to say no to me now? I don't like saying no to me. I like saying yes to me, to be in full control. And the next moment that this happens in life is when you become a parent and you have a child. And you learn this lesson all over again, even to deeper depths. Like, I am so selfish. I'm so selfish that I just want to sit on my couch and let my son yell at me, Dad, come watch me. Dad, come watch me. I'm like, you're just playing video games. I don't want to come watch you. You should turn that TV off anyway. And I'm not even willing to look up. That's how selfish I am. Let's just be honest. That's the degree it goes to. Selfishness becomes your master. And when selfishness is your master, it doesn't make you better. Do you know where master selfishness takes you, demands that you go, leads you to? He leads you to the land of self-centeredness. This is where you go. And this master orders you to say yes to you every single time. Yeah, that feels good. Yeah, that desire, go with it. Yeah, that thing you want, go ahead. And when you start to say yes to that, you start to realize, hindsight, usually too late, that you're being led in a direction you don't want to go. I mean, let's be honest. Look at your finances. If you start to pattern your behavior that direction, you just buy what feels good. You just buy the selfish things in your life. You're like, yeah, I just want it though. I just want it. I want the thing more than I want financial security. And all of a sudden you look at your bank account like, I don't know what happened. I'm poor all the time. I know exactly what happened. Like, just look at what you spent. Look at your bills. Look at what you spent your money on. It's gone. Why? Because everything is centered on you. Master sin defines that as liberation. And think about this. We talk about being free in our world as liberation. We're like, if I just do whatever I want all the time, that means that I'm free. No. Self-centeredness liberates you from you. It liberates you from you. It frees you from becoming your truest, most authentic self. It actually leads you towards duplicity. You wake up and you realize it's led you somewhere else. You wake up one day and there's not one of you that wakes up. There's two of you. There's multiples of you. I'm not talking about personalities. You have the one that your wife sees. You have the one that your coworker sees. You have the one that church people see. You have the one for each environment that you've created because you've been traveling in a direction towards self-centeredness. And that requires that you justify. That requires that you compartmentalize. That requires that you hide things from others. And you start to become different people in each crowd. And here's what if other people were able to just sit you down, and if they saw this happening, others, including Paul, would tell you, I urge you, brothers and sisters, again, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. This is your response to God. Do you want sin to be your master? This is why surrendering is actually the way to freedom. This is why surrender, when you decide, I'm going to surrender everything. Why? Because something's going to be your master. It's going to be sin, it's going to be God, it's going to be something. You're not ever able to be your master fully. Because you're going to say yes to some things, and whatever you say yes to takes control. And when you say yes to God, you start to experience freedom. Paul continues on with his warning. He says, do not conform to the pattern of this world. Don't do the same thing as everybody else, just because everybody else is doing it. Like, evaluate, think about it, think it through. If sin is your master, it's going to split you in half. You're going to see it. You're going to see it in your relationships. Other people are going to see it in your relationships. It increases your capacity for duplicity. It will place you in the center of your world. And whenever you place yourself in the center of your world shrinks. You become smaller. You know, when you become big is when you start to give yourself away. That's when your world expands. That's when your impact expands. That's when you start to become bigger and bigger, larger and larger. Not because you want credit for it and it's about you, but because you're willing to sacrifice for everybody else, and all of a sudden, people see you differently. Paul continues on. He says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's how you're transformed. It starts with how you think, how you see yourself. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. And I know, for some of us in here, this idea of relinquishing authority and power in the decision-making process to God, to His will, is terrifying. Like, that sounds scary. I don't know. That means I don't know what God's going to ask me to do. And if I submit to Him, that means I have to say, I'm predetermining a yes, and I don't even know where He's going to ask me to go or what He's going to ask me to do. And that's terrifying because we like things to be our way, right? This is the tension. This is what it's all about. This is where that tension lies. And if you are more afraid of God's will taking you somewhere that you might not want to go in your life, if you're more afraid of that than what sin can and will do in your life, then you've been seduced. Then you've been deceived by sin. And honestly, you've reduced God. You've reduced Him to a sin forgiver. That's all He does. You just mess up, and then once you mess up, you just ask for forgiveness. You go on your way, you do your own thing again, until you have to circle back around. He becomes a backup plan. Yeah, I'm going to do my thing, and once my thing doesn't work out, then I'll come back around. Then I'll circle back. We'll see what God says. Or a last resort. Like, yeah, I'll decide eventually to follow God. But I'm going to do everything in my 20s and my 30s and my 40s, sometimes my 50s. Like, I'm going to live my life the way I want to live until I feel like it's coming down to the end. Then it's like, once I'm at a stage of life that the sin parts don't sound quite so much fun, exhausting, tiring, like, yeah, I don't want to do that anymore. Then I'll decide to follow God. Then I'm going to decide, okay, now's the time. It's a last resort thing for you. This is a problem. This is a problem when we reduce God to this. Because people, and those of us that are in this room and those of us that are in your life that have experienced this, they would tell you. They've experienced what trusting God actually does. When you decide to give everything to Him, they've experienced what that looks like in their relationships, with their finances, with their career, with their peace, with their happiness, with their joy. And they would tell you that Paul is absolutely correct. His will is good, pleasing, perfect. It's complete. that His will for you, that God that created you, that knows every hair on your body and loves you in spite of all of the you decisions that you've made. His will for you is good. And it's still good. So this morning, the first habit to safeguard your soul is to surrender your will. It's to lay your will down, decide, okay, I'm going to predetermine, I'm going to decide that God takes the lead, that God is in charge, that God has all of me in His hands and He can do what He wants to do with me because I believe that His will for me is good and I will be better off for it. Jesus actually said this in Luke chapter 9, verse 23. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Follow me. This is a form of submission. Following someone, just think of this practically. When you follow someone, you're constantly deciding. If you don't know where you're going and you're just following, you're constantly deciding that you're going to take another step wherever they've gone in that same direction. I mean, think about this. Like, when I was in Bible college and I had to get from point A to point B and I didn't know where I was going, never been there before, I had to research and figure out, like, lay out a map and look at all the turns I was going to have to make, and I would put like a piece of paper down and I would make all of my turns that I was going to have to take on the paper, like 12 of them. And I would drive looking at that paper just for the next step, hoping I wasn't going to miss it in the craziness of Southern California traffic. Like, okay, my turn's coming up in like 2 miles, so I've got to get over there. Start seeing the sign. I got to get over there. Every single step you have to follow. You have to obey the directions in front of you. And if you miss it, oh my goodness. We have this thing now. It's called Google Maps, and it makes it so much easier. And it's wonderful. But you still have a decision to make. Am I going to let that lady in the map tell me how to get there? Because if you decide that you're going to do, I know better, I'm going to do my own thing, you're going to get off course, right? Following requires submission. It requires that. The cross is symbolic of deciding that your dependence is not on you any longer. That it's not on you anymore. That Jesus wants you to declare your dependence on Him. Verse 25, Jesus says, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? You're no longer your authentic. You're no longer you. You have multiple yous, and none of them are the one that you want to be. None of them are. The way that we do this, the way that we submit, the way that we decide ahead of time, God, I'm going to give it all to you. I'm going to give myself to you. I'm going to submit to you. I'm going to be a living sacrifice. I'm going to walk this planet continuously, sacrificing myself and my will in place for yours. The way that we do this, and this is a pattern of behavior. This is a habit I've tried to form. I pray this prayer on a regular basis. So I try to do this, especially in the mornings, to kind of set the tone for the day. And I don't pray the same way every single time. It's not like a recited prayer. But this is the basic idea you'll get. Heavenly Father, I surrender myself to you. My hands and all I do, my feet and everywhere I go, my eyes and all that I look upon, my ears and all that I listen to, my tongue and all the words I speak, my thoughts and desires, my hopes and dreams, my talent and opportunity, I surrender all to you. Your will be done through me today. I pray this on a regular basis. And every single time, it resets me back to that initial starting point. It sets the tone for the day. And honestly, it sensitizes my soul. It sensitizes my conscience for when I approach that cross point, I back away. Because I'm no longer numb. I've submitted myself. I am aware of where God wants me to go. And it's not my will, it's His will. And if I understand this is not God's will, then I've got to step back from it. You don't numbly stumble across that boundary anymore. You're aware as you approach and you step back from it. And it starts with this regularity. You do this over and over again. You know, and I get this. Some of you this morning, you might be thinking, I wish I would have heard that 6 months ago. I wish I would have heard that 5 years ago. I wish I would have heard that a decade ago. Because my life would be radically different if I had paid attention to that, if I would have listened to that. But here's what you need to hear. Even though your life might have taken a turn or a direction in a way that you didn't like it to, that you didn't really want it to, and yet you did anyway. This is the way back. These habits are the way back. Not only does it safeguard you, it brings you back to that spot. Because at the root of it all is a decision. Am I going to trust myself more, or am I going to trust God more? Am I going to submit or not? Selfishness, sin, that's a horrible master. It takes you to places you never wanted to go. It leads you to do things you never wanted to do. It allows you to become someone you never wanted to become. Following Jesus will make your life better and make you better at life. We say this all the time here. And I truly, honestly believe that. That it's not going to make it easier, but it will make it better. That when you follow Jesus, life will get better and you will get better at life. He will lead you to close that gap of the duplicity. He will lead you to become the single person, the you that He created you to be, living out the full potential of that. He'll lead you to actually have peace with yourself. I mean, we work really hard to have peace with everybody else, and it's terrifying to even think about trying to have peace with ourselves. That's where God will lead you. He'll lead you to be happy with you. That's amazing. That's where when you see people walking around and they're joyful all the time, regardless of what they're facing, you're like, what is wrong with you? They're like, it's nothing wrong. I've submitted. I've decided that my life is not my own. I'm just going to go and do whatever God asked me to do. And when I do that, it is so wonderful. Life is so much better. I don't have to rely on the situations and circumstances to allow me to be happy or not. I do have a couple of discussion questions because I want this conversation to continue on even after this morning. When was the last time you heard a story and thought, how do they live with themselves? What does that response highlight in you? What does the following statement bring to mind? The health of your soul determines your tolerance for duplicity. And then lastly, what emotions does the idea of unconditional surrender to God surface in you? And why? I'm going to pray, and then we're all going to go enjoy some sunshine. Go touch some grass. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for everything that you do for us. We thank you that regardless of how badly and how much we've chosen sin to be our master, that you graciously, mercifully open your arms and invite us back to you. And God, we might have made some horrible mistakes, but as bad as we might have done, you still have a plan and a future for us. That there is a return to the you that you created us to be. God, I pray that we would choose that. We would choose that regardless of how embarrassing that might be. We choose that regardless of how difficult that might be or how painful that might be. And God, I pray that we would choose day in and day out to open our hands to open our hearts, to open our minds, and offer all of us, everything that makes me, everything that makes us up, we offer that to you. We submit to you today. We thank you for first loving us. In your name I pray. Amen. Thanks for being here with us. We'll see you next week for part 2 of Living with Yourself.